He wasn't born to wear a crown, he was born to kneel. Louis VII spent his childhood not among swords and banners, but under the silence of monastery walls, where the only voices were scripture and shadow. He was meant to be a monk, a vessel of God's will, and when fate tore that future away from him, when his older brother died and the crown was thrust onto his head, Louis didn't rise like a king. He carried the crown like a cross. While other rulers waged war with blood and fire, Louis dreamed of dying a saint, of leading not armies, but pilgrims. He believed God had chosen him to cleanse the world with prayer, and if needed, with steel. But the world he marched into wasn't holy. It was cruel, rotten, splintered by greed, power, and betrayal. The Holy Land wasn't waiting to be saved, it was waiting to destroy him. Before Louis, there had been others. Kings who carved kingdoms out of chaos with iron fists and monstrous will. One of them stormed east like a predator, took Antioch, bled for it, ruled it with wrath. Another would come after, a lion in the skin of a man who'd set siege to empires and bring hell to Jerusalem. But Louis was neither beast nor lion. He was something softer, something purer, something destined to die in pieces. He believed in the sacred cause. He took the vow. He crossed the seas. And what he found was not salvation, but a slow, grinding annihilation of everything he held sacred: his marriage, his army, his reputation, his soul. This is not the story of a hero's triumph. This is the story of a man undone by belief itself, a Crusader king who lost his war, his crown, and his soul. He began not on the battlefield, but in prayer, alone, unready, crowned by accident. And it was there, in the cold, echoing chambers of his youth, that the destruction of Louis VII truly began. He was crowned in silence. No cheers, no glory, no thunder of war horses, just a thin, pale boy with monk's eyes and a spine shaped by prayer, not command. Louis VII never chased the throne, it chased him. His older brother had been the warrior, the heir, the one molded for kingship. Louis had been the spare, sent to grow up among candlelight and cloisters, meant to rot in quiet holiness. But fate is cruel. Death swept his brother off the board, and the crown, cold, gold, and far too heavy, was slammed down upon his head. He didn't fight it. That was the terrifying part. He accepted it, not with pride, but with obedience, as if it were penance. Louis wasn't stupid, but he was sincere. He brought to the throne something few kings ever dared, a fear of sin greater than a fear of failure. While other rulers schemed with swords and poison, Louis clutched relics and begged saints for guidance. He would fast before making decisions. He would wander the woods, barefoot, to feel closer to God. To his court, it wasn't noble. It was unnerving. His lords whispered that the king was more priest than monarch, that he wore the crown like a hair shirt, that behind those calm, watery eyes lay something dangerous, a man who believed too deeply, because blind faith in the hands of a king isn't virtue, it's a weapon pointed inward. France was not yet the machine it would become. It was fragmented, held together by loyalty, not force. And Louis, in his youth, did not inspire fear, he inspired discomfort. His subjects saw a man who confessed too often, prayed too long, forgave too easily. They wanted a sovereign. What they got was a confessor wearing a crown, but Louis didn't need their trust. He believed he had something stronger, divine purpose. He thought if he lived righteously, the kingdom would follow, that if he walked in Christ's image, the the realm would fall in line. And so he ruled like a man trying to earn heaven, not govern earth. Until one day, a woman walked into his court, wrapped in silk and fire, and the monk king made a decision that would unmake both their lives. She was everything he was. Elena of Aquitaine walked into Louis's life like a thunderstorm draped in velvet, radiant, dangerous, and utterly untamed. She wasn't there to be saved, she was there to rule. One of the richest women in Europe, heiress to the south, and already whispered about like a legend. Louis looked at her and saw divine providence. Elena looked at Louis and saw a boy in a cassock pretending to be king. Their marriage wasn't forged in passion, it was forged in calculation. The union stitched together northern and southern France, Wessex and Aquitaine, monastery and court. To Louis, it was a holy alliance. To Elena, it was a leash. From the beginning, they moved through two different worlds. Louis tried to remake her in his image, piety, modesty, obedience. But Elena refused to shrink. She drank wine with knights, hunted like a man, and debated bishops in open court. She was sharp, sensual, impatient, and worst of all, unafraid. The courtiers watched them with silent dread. The queen who laughed too loud, the king who flinched at her voice. Behind every royal smile was a fracture growing deeper by the year. He wanted a saint, she wanted a partner. What they had was a war, and then the unthinkable happened. A child was born and died. The loss shattered Louis. He turned further inward, deeper into prayer, fasting, obsession. He began to believe it was punishment, that God was testing his virtue through Elena's defiance, that perhaps he had married pride itself, and pride must be purified. Elena, meanwhile, saw only a man crumbling, a king terrified of his own wife. And in that hollow space between them, something dark began to form, resentment with no name, the kind that doesn't explode but corrodes. Still, they endured. Because they had to. The kingdom depended on their union. But a storm was coming from the east, one that would drag both of them into the sand, the sword, and the silence of the Holy Land. A crusade not just of armies, but of faith, flesh, and fracture. It began with blood in Edessa, a Christian city fallen to Muslim hands, slaughtered priests, churches set to flame, corpses hanging from cathedral beams. The news crossed the sea like a funeral bell, and Louis heard it not as a warning, but a calling. He believed it was a sign that God was summoning him to finish what the First Crusaders had started, to walk where Christ walked, to fight where saints had bled. He didn't see political chaos, he saw prophecy. And in that moment, the monk inside the king rose higher than the crown. He swore the vow in public, trembling and tearful, as if the fire of heaven burned behind his eyes. France was stunned. This wasn't a commander taking up arms, it was a penitent sacrificing his soul. Louis summoned the lords, the knights, the bishops. He called it a crusade, but in truth, it was a pilgrimage to redemption, a march to cleanse himself, his marriage, and the kingdom in one sacred tide. Elena stood beside him, radiant and unreadable. She agreed to go, of course, publicly, but behind the court's smiles, she began preparing her own retinue, her own authority. She wasn't walking behind Louis. She was walking with him, and eventually far ahead. The court watched as she packed her banners, her armor, her ladies, and her private guards. The whispers began. Was this still a queen or something else entirely? But Louis didn't hear them. He was already gone, already dreaming of Jerusalem, already lost in the shadow of men like Bohemond, who had carved Antioch from bone and sand a century earlier. Louis believed he could follow that path, but cleanse it. He would be a crusader, yes, but one guided by purity, not appetite. That was the lie he told himself, because no one marches into the East without appetite, and no one leaves it clean. The armies assembled, the banners lifted, the blessings spoken. France moved not like an army, but like a church on the march, and at the head rode a king trembling with righteousness and blind to what awaited him in the dark ridges of Anatolia. The road to hell wasn't paved with sin, it was paved with snow, starvation, and silence. Louis led his army through Anatolia like a lamb into the butcher's yard, trusting in maps drawn by cowards and promises whispered by men with knives behind their backs. The Byzantine emperor had pledged safe passage. What he gave was sabotage. Routes led straight into ambush. Supplies vanished, and one by one, French knights began to disappear into the mountains, dragged off by Turkish riders or swallowed whole by frost. Louis had imagined a sacred march. Instead, he found a graveyard that moved beneath his feet. The further east they pressed, the less it looked like a crusade and more like a funeral with banners. Men froze to death beside their horses. Armor cracked from cold. Entire companies broke and scattered. And Louis, still clinging to relics, still fasting, still praying, refused to retreat. He said it was a trial, that God was testing them, but there was no fire in the sky. Only the grinding wind and the screams of men being cut down in white silence. Then came Mount Cadmus. The king took a separate route against the advice of his captains. His personal guard marched into a narrow pass. And that's when the Turks struck. They poured down from the ridges like smoke and steel. Chaos erupted. Arrows sang. Blood froze midair. Louis's entire escort was butchered in minutes. And the king, alone, terrified, was forced to scramble up a rock with his sword in one hand and the holy cross in the other. That image would haunt his men forever. Not a warrior, but a monk in armor, clinging to a cliff, staring into death. He survived, barely, but something broke that day, not just in the army, in him. The silence after Cadmus wasn't reverent, it was hollow. The kind of silence that follows a revelation, that holiness doesn't protect you from horror. It invites it. And while Louis licked his wounds, behind him, Elena's presence was shifting. No longer just a queen on the march, but a queen whose patience with her king was bleeding away, drop by drop, mile by mile. She stopped looking at him like a king. Somewhere between the snowdrifts of Anatolia and the dust of Antioch, Elena's gaze shifted from reverence to revulsion. She had followed Louis across mountains and deserts, watched his army rot, watched him fast while men starved, watched him preach while captains begged for leadership. And in that spiral of ruin, she saw not a ruler, but a ghost wrapped in holy cloth. Antioch was the breaking point. They arrived as pilgrims, but Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, and Elena's uncle, greeted her like returning royalty. The court lit up. She came alive. Here she wasn't a queen drowning in her husband's shadow. She was blood of the city, its native daughter, celebrated, desired. She and Raymond spoke late into the night, walked alone through gardens, laughed where Louis stood silent. The rumors were immediate. Whispers of incest, of lust, of conspiracy. It didn't matter if they were true. What mattered was that Louis heard them and froze. He confronted her, not as a husband, not even as a man, but as a priest with trembling hands and hollow eyes. She didn't weep, she didn't deny. She looked him in the face and said what the whole crusade had been screaming in silence: "You are not my king." He snapped. He threatened to leave Antioch, to abandon Raymond, to march on alone. She said fine. She offered to stay behind. She didn't plead, she didn't beg. And Louis realized in that moment he had lost more than her love, he had lost her fear. The queen no longer belonged to the king. He dragged her from the city anyway, forced her to march again under scorching sun and bitter contempt. But the damage was done. Something had broken cleanly between them, and the fracture ran deeper than marriage. It went straight through the idea of unity itself. If the queen and king could not share a tent, how could they share a cause? Still, Jerusalem loomed on the horizon, the holy city, the purpose, the dream, the prize. But when Louis looked toward it, he no longer saw salvation. He saw silence, and that silence was waiting. Jerusalem did not sing, it did not shine, it did not welcome him with hymns or miracles. When Louis finally entered the holy city, dust-caked, half-starved, dragging the tatters of his army and his marriage, he expected transcendence. What he found was bureaucracy, petty nobles, power games played in the name of Christ. The kingdom of heaven was no cathedral. It was a crumbling fort surrounded by mistrust, where Christian lords plotted against each other more viciously than against the enemy. Louis prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He wept, he fasted, he begged God to speak, but the stones were silent. The priests offered ceremony, not clarity. No vision came, no divine voice. He had crossed mountains, lost comrades, watched his wife drift into another man's orbit, and for what? To stand before the tomb of Christ and feel absolutely nothing. The silence turned inward, and it began to rot. Behind closed doors, plans were drawn for a final campaign, a strike on Damascus, the last great Muslim stronghold nearby. The court urged haste before the army dissolved entirely. Louis agreed, but not with conviction. He wasn't marching toward victory. He was walking toward noise, any noise, to drown out the absence that had filled him since Mount Cadmus. He still wore his relics. He still muttered prayers. But something had changed in the way he held his sword, no longer with faith, but with fatigue. Elena, meanwhile, had become a shadow behind him. They barely spoke. Their camps were separate. Their gazes, when they met, were cold glass. The crusade had started as a shared vow. Now it was a long funeral with two corpses walking in opposite directions. And yet Damascus lay ahead. One last chance to salvage purpose. One last city to conquer. One last place to die. Damascus did not fall. It never even flinched. What was meant to be the crown jewel of Louis's crusade became its tombstone, etched in heat, betrayal, and cowardice. The plan had been simple: surround the city, cut off supply, and break the gate. But nothing about Louis's crusade had ever followed plan. And now, in the dust-choked orchards outside Damascus, it all collapsed in a scream. The siege lasted 4 days. 4. In that time, alliances frayed like rope under flame. The barons argued. The Germans blamed the French. The French blamed the locals. The locals just watched, waiting to see which side would die slower. Louis begged for unity, but there was nothing left to unite. His knights had seen too many failures, spilled too much blood for too little purpose. Some believed the city had been betrayed from within, that someone had taken a bribe to move the camp to the weakest side of the walls. Others believed God had simply abandoned them. The truth didn't matter. The retreat did. Louis left Damascus under cover of night, flanked by broken men and poisoned silence. No glory, no triumph. Just a long trail of boot prints through wasted dust. His crusade was over, but not officially, not ceremonially, just over, like a man walking out of his own funeral. And in that quiet ruin, Elena said nothing. She didn't rage. She didn't mock. She didn't cry. She looked at him like a stranger. And Louis, in turn, saw in her the truth he had denied since Antioch. She had already left him. The queen was still beside him in flesh, but her spirit was gone, and with it, the last illusion of union. He hadn't just lost Damascus, he had lost her. The long road back to France stretched out like a sentence. And what awaited them, there was colder than desert nights, crueler than Turkish blades, home. A home where nothing would be the same, and where everything he had once ruled would now slip quietly from his hands. France did not weep when he returned. There were no parades, no hymns, just mud, cold stone, and the sound of power slipping from Louis's hands. The crusade was supposed to redeem him. Instead, it damned him. And now the king walked back into his own kingdom like a ghost in royal robes, his army scattered, his prestige shattered, and his wife already planning her exit. Elena did not wait long. She had endured the journey home in silence, but once her feet touched French soil, she made her move. She demanded an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, of course, a technicality they had long ignored. But everyone knew the truth. She had married a monk who mistook a crown for a halo, and she was done pretending. Louis, weakened and spiritually hollowed, didn't fight. He let her go. What choice did he have? But she didn't just leave, she detonated. Within months, Elena married a new man, young, ruthless, and burning with ambition, Henry, Duke of Anjou. And with her she brought Aquitaine, half of France's wealth and land. Louis didn't lose a wife. He lost the entire south. He lost the future, and it didn't stop there. Elena and Henry would soon have a son. That son would one day become Richard the Lionheart, a different kind of crusader, a fire forged in everything Louis was not, the lion to his lamb, the sword to his cross. The shadow of that child would one day loom over every failure Louis carried in silence. But Louis didn't rage. He didn't retaliate. He buried the shame in prayer. He turned inward again, deeper this time. Away from politics, away from ambition. France was changing, power was shifting, and Louis, the king once chosen by God, was now a relic in a kingdom that no longer believed in relics. And yet the story wasn't done. Because somewhere in the depths of his ruin, Louis would try to build again, not for glory, not for faith, but for something smaller, something he hoped could outlive the silence. He tried to start over, but the world no longer listened. After the crusade collapsed, after Elena vanished into another man's bed and crowned him with her lands, Louis VII returned to Paris a king in name only. His authority was paper-thin. His voice, once trembling with divine certainty, now sounded like an echo in his own halls. The lords respected him out of tradition, not fear. The people obeyed him because there was no one else, yet. He remarried, not for love, but for survival. Adela of Champagne gave him what he no longer dared hope for: a son, a living heir. a boy who would one day become Philip Augustus, a king of steel and strategy. But Louis would not live to see that greatness unfold. He was not a builder anymore. He was a placeholder, the quiet breath between two storms, and yet he tried. He funded abbeys, brokered minor peace, supported reforms. But every gesture was a whisper compared to the roar of what was rising. Henry of Anjou was now King of England. Elena stood beside him, regal and unstoppable. Their children grew like wolves. Across the Channel, the Plantagenet dynasty took shape, built on the bones of Louis's failure. The chroniclers stopped writing about him. The church stopped praising him. In royal portraits, his image became fainter, softer, less king, more penitent. He no longer wore his crown with pride. He wore it like a scar, and though the kingdom endured, Louis did not. The light in his court grew dim. Foreign envies ignored him. His barons spoke with polite distance. France waited. Not for his orders, for his death. But even then, Louis clung to one final delusion, that perhaps with enough humility, with enough sacrifice, he could still reach heaven, still find meaning in the wreckage. But the God he marched for had gone quiet long ago, and the only voice left was the one inside him, telling him, at last, the truth. He died as he lived, quietly, devoutly, and forgotten. No sword in his hand, no triumph in his wake. Just a thin, pale man wrapped in linen, buried in the shadow of kings far greater and far crueler. When Louis VII slipped from this world in 1180, there were no riots of grief, no hymns of legend. France did not tremble, it merely moved on. His final days were spent in prayer, cloistered behind monastery walls, where even the monks had long stopped seeing him as a sovereign. He fasted obsessively, punished himself with silence, and spoke of Jerusalem as if it were a wound still festering inside him. But he would never return there. The holy city was lost, not to the Muslims, but to the myth he had built around it. It had devoured him once, and it no longer needed seconds. When they buried him, they called him Louis the Pious, a harmless title to mask a legacy of failure, not a warrior, not a builder, not a statesman. Just a man who mistook faith for command and watched the world bleed around him because of it. But history has sharper teeth than pity. Louis didn't just lose a war. He lost a wife who remade the world without him. He lost a crown that splintered under his indecision, and he lost a soul that no crusade, no relic, no prayer could ever truly cleanse. He had marched east to become a saint. He returned a shadow. And that shadow still lingers, not in glory, but in warning. Because between the monsters of the First Crusade and the fire of the Third, there stood a man too holy to kill and too weak to lead. And that is the true horror of Louis VII, the Crusader king who lost his war, his crown, and his soul. He wasn't a tyrant, he wasn't a conqueror, he wasn't even a hero. Louis VII was something far more terrifying, a good man in the wrong war, a believer crushed by the very faith that was supposed to save him. And when the banners fell, when the relics rusted, and the silence of failure screamed louder than any trumpet, he didn't rage. He simply vanished. But the Crusades did not stop with him. Before Louis, there was a warlord who carved his kingdom from the bones of Antioch, a beast who answered God's call with blood and steel. After Louis, another king would rise, louder, sharper, and far more dangerous. A lion who burned with vengeance and marched not for salvation, but for domination. Between them stands Louis, the still point in a storm of predators. If you want to see how it all began, how a monster in mail stormed the east to forge his own dominion, watch our episode on the First Crusade and the man who ripped Antioch from the earth. And if you want to witness what came next, when the roar of Richard the Lionheart shook the walls of Jerusalem, his reckoning is waiting. And as for what follows, there are still darker crowns to come. We'll see you in the next chapter.